we're going to explore a little bit more of what Bonhoeffer meant by this term, living in the world come of age. We kind of got there a little bit last week, but we want to dive in and spend some more time on that idea in order to help us then move further into how does a world like this view religion, and how does religion work or not work in that kind of a world, and then what kind of church is actually functional and effective in that kind of a world. And so, so today is kind of like an excursus into that idea. So we're not going to come up with too many solutions in terms of, well, now that we know this, how about that? What we need to do is know this, and next week, and then we'll be able to explore some ideas about. This is the other thing about German theologians, is they're not succinct. They take a long time to explain what they're thinking about, but you get a good grasp of it by the time you're done if you've stuck with it. So that's what we're going to do. So this definition of living in the world come of age, Bonhoeffer's definition of it is a world of increasing maturity that was able to arrange itself very well without the tutelage of religion or God. To live as if God did not exist. And so that's his assessment of the world at the time in which he was living. And early, that assessment was cast for him in a somewhat negative light, to say, well, this is the unfortunate circumstance of where we are. But in the prison years, curiously, that changes. And he sees this as a more positive outcome. And so one of the questions that prompts as you consider that is, well, why would this that doesn't sound very encouraging, why would that be a positive, as we're thinking about the church's relationship to that? I mean, just think for a moment, what do you think that could be? And Phil, you'll have to be ready with the microphone here. So what do you think? Just as you think, how would that change from a positive to a negative, or from a negative to a positive?
Somebody have an idea? Could it be that disorientation that'll lead to reorientation?
Well, I think there's always a possibility for that. Yeah. Now nobody wants to get on tape.
All right,
where somebody is listening and say,
raise your hand.
Who raised that question?
If anybody wants it, and I'll turn this off so they won't hear what you say on the YouTube. I'm not going to be dogmatic about this, because obviously I'm not Bonhoeffer and so forth. But I think that this changes for him to a positive, because it helps him deal with reality, to say, oh, okay, so the disorientation piece comes in. This is the way things are, and we can't change that necessarily. So we have to adapt in some way to the way things are, and knowing that for certain helps us know how to move in that. And so, in a sense, he then grasped this idea that, okay, if that's reality, what do we do with that? And he discovers then that the freedom that people are experiencing in this world of increasing maturity is not just freedom from God, but from previous authorities who claim to speak for God. So not just the idea of God, but anybody who based their understanding or their worldview on that. And so he's simply reflecting on the world as it is, and he's trying to come at this from a disinterested observer stance. He has no bias. He's trying to do this with no bias. Okay, so if he comes at it from that standpoint, what does he gain, and how does that inform his
going forward. So he traces the development of this world from the 13th century as he's thinking through this idea. Primarily that refers to the emergence of humanism as a worldview, as a philosophy, as a way to live, breaking free from the views of reality taught by the church. Because obviously prior to that time, the church was the primary authority in the world, and so the church made these decisions, and the church had the answers for how life was to be lived and how we were to understand things. And so humanity, with the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and so forth, began to break away from that authoritarian place of the church and began to challenge the church. And the church didn't respond to that very well. It began to be confrontive in return. And, when you burn people at the stake, that has a pretty strong, sense of let's not continue in that direction. So it discourages people from conversation. So humanism begins to take hold, and science begins to emerge. And I don't want to set up in our minds this conflict between science and religion. That's not what we're talking about here. There can be that kind of a conflict. People can make that a conflict. It doesn't have to be. And so in the comments that follow, please don't think I'm setting up this argument for one of these deeper kinds of things. That's just the reality is that science has become, for many people, has taken the place of religion in terms of understanding the world and construction of the world and so forth. And so science began to be the way we understood the world, through the discovery of facts, the laws of nature, and so forth and so on. And of course, there's a good argument to be made, as has been made by some people who are trying to defend the view of the origins of science, to say, if it weren't for religion, there wouldn't be science, because religion anticipated a orderly universe that could be discovered and understood and so forth. And so religion paved the way for science to become what it did. The scientists won't, concede to that easily, but that is an argument in favor of this. But at any rate, science began to become the way that people understood the laws of nature and the discovery of facts. And so this freedom from God as the working hypothesis, as the thing behind, as the being behind all things, began to seep into other aspects of the world's grasp. So art, politics, ethics. Religion no longer dominated the social structures that shaped the world. It began to move away from that. And so the new world would be constructed on the way that we, and by we I mean humankind, not God, would interpret life. Whether through law, morality, religion, or the sciences. So we became the center of the universe, and we become determinative in what the world is and what it should be and how we understand that. And so science has become the new authority, and replaced religion in the construction of the world come of age. And we see this in the world in which we live, don't we? There are these conflicts between science and belief and religion, because science is increasingly able to answer a number of questions that had previously been religion's jurisdiction, at least back in that time, and so we all remember famously the Galileo issue, and the church doubling down on the earth is the center of the universe, and Galileo going, I don't think that's right. and the church, becoming very, very dominant in their view because they could, and Galileo saying, well, I'm not sure that you understand the issue. So, and so a number of those things began to crop up, where the church had very, and I say this not pejoratively, but accurately, I think, the church had sometimes a very simplistic view of things. Just say, well, if you didn't understand the mechanics of it, you just said, well, God did it. And that's it. And that, actually, there's a name for that in our current philosophical world, kind of the God gap is what they call it. When you've reached the limit of your understanding, then you simply say, well, God did it. Or it's up to God and we can't understand it. And of course, now that presupposes that you believe in God. So for people who don't hold that belief, there is no such thing as a God gap. And so it's just a press. We just don't know yet what we will know. And so it's a constant move. So this is the world that Bonhoeffer sees developing and having developed, and of course there's some scary aspects to that too. But science becomes the prevailing worldview, and it came not only to examine the world, but then to interpret the world and to narrate the world. And so scientific models set up their own instruments of control by precluding God as appropriate causation. Now, not every scientist does that, but science as a general kind of discipline tends to in our world. I was just recently came across, so Neil deGrasse Tyson, astrophysicist, great. He's a very public person, okay? Also very public in his non-belief that God has any purpose or meaning or value in the world. And curiously, he doesn't identify as an atheist. He identifies as an agnostic, but only because he's being very intellectually honest. Because he cannot with certainty say there is no God, but he's also not very certain that there is anything, at all.
And that would mean someone who believes in God, but God can't be known. Is that what the...
Well, there are shades, obviously, of that. And a pure agnostic that I think he would identify as is, there may be something out there, but if there is, it's way beyond what we can grab. But the bottom line is, and he stated this publicly, is he just doesn't care. He said that. I don't care. If you want to do that. Yeah.
It is amusing if you read works of Stephen Hawking.
Mm-hmm.
As he's beginning to grapple and try to understand the Big Bang, he says there's a tendency of the universe to produce worthwhile things. And there's some force which seems to be guiding it in this direction. To this Christian, I find that very amusing.
It's interesting that they come to that. Yes, but Hawking also said, that belief in God, for instance, is simply for those people who are afraid of the dark. That's a famous quote of his. So there is this sense that, Tyson's take on that is actually the opposite. He said in an interview on a British news program or talk program that the reason he didn't believe in God is because all the gods that he had been taught about had some benevolent character to them, And he said, knowing how many ways the universe is out to kill you, I can't believe that God would be benevolent, And so he takes that opposite view, that there's so many ways that you can be wiped out in the universe, as opposed to Hawking's view that, there does generally seem to be a trend towards goodness that develops and something encouraging that. It all kind of comes down to presuppositions in a sense, because, I don't know if you've heard of Hugh Ross is another astrophysicist now whose presupposition is that there is a God.
and that God has been guiding all of this development and so forth. And his understanding of science leads in that direction. And so he kind of points out the indicators of God's presence, whereas the others ignore that as though it's not possible. So your presuppositions do make a difference as to where you come out. And oftentimes our problem as people of faith is that we try to argue conclusions without knowing the presuppositions. And that's never going to work, because it's like two people discussing a sport. Both of them think they're discussing the same thing. One is talking about tennis, the other's talking about pickleball. Well, there's similarities, but in the end they're two different kind of things. And so at some point the conclusions are going to clash, and that's what happens in our conversations with people, is that we have this idea that we share the same presuppositions, but we have to disabuse ourselves of that idea because we don't. And so it's more important for us to explore presuppositions in our conversations than it is conclusions, because obviously conclusions are the logical result of that, of your presupposition. So if your presupposition is a fallacy, then you can correct that, or you can at least discuss the right thing. But arguing about conclusions is fruitless. So that's part of the church's task in the world come of age, is to recognize the presupposition of that kind of a world, and then say, well, what is our approach from this standpoint then? How do we get to the issue that really matters, so that we can arrive at a place that there is a common and a inclusive conclusion? So science, in a sense, then, has become, for the secular world, the way of explaining what was previously the jurisdiction of the church, and it's constantly moving, or it's continually moving the frontiers and boundaries of human knowledge. And there's benefits to that. Of course, science has been a great benefit and tool and help to humankind, but it also exacts a price for that benefit, because it moves us further and further away from the opportunity for God to be present in our world, because honestly, you don't have a need of God when nature destroys your home, because you have insurance, and so the more we know about how things work, the less we need God as the safety net for the life in which we live. And that's very evident in the world in which we live. Not too many people, even in our highly politicized and religious politics, right now it's very confrontive, but even before, there was always lip service given to religion. Presidents would often end their speeches with, God bless America and all of that. And so there was this civil religion, so to speak, that kind of governed our common welfare and our common society. And so there was lip service given to God, but nobody, no president would get up, at least in recent times, and say, what is it that God wants to do in our world that we can participate in and move forward in an international way? That would be suicide, political suicide, for a politician to do that in our day. There was a day when Abraham Lincoln is famous for invoking God, on to say, the God of creation, wants us to respond in a certain way. But recently, that's not been happening. So with the increase of secularization, humankind perceives itself as a creative subject, as an agent of history responsible for one's own destiny, not just simply a cog in the wheel of God's machine. So they are something, participate in that process. So we have become the creators of our own world, with reason and rationality as the basis for our assumptions and conclusions.
However, this is always shifting, despite our hopes otherwise. The way things are, how you see things is different from how others see them. And so reason and rationality don't always work because we're coming from different points of departure. Okay, so does this make sense so far? You still tracking? And Bonhoeffer's thinking about all this stuff when he's in jail. Okay, so, which is probably a good thing, because what else do you have to do in jail? You don't have many other responsibilities, so it gives him time to think, which is often helpful when you think about the Apostle Paul too. Who spent a lot of time in jail, and that's why we have most of the New Testament. So, so there was a reason why he was in jail, and that's that would have been one of the first questions. Why did I spend so much time in jail, God? And God said, well, we needed the New Testament, and you needed time to write, and so it just became helpful. So, anyways, so what we hadn't counted on, at least this world come of age, is that a universally accepted rationality is itself elusive. We can't all agree on what is a universal rationality. And so pragmatism has become the operative dynamic in many social structures. What is it that actually works? And so that's become more determinative than religion ever was. So instead of saying this is what you should do, we just simply say, well, this is what it is, so how do we do this? How do we do this? And so the modern state has become the new authority, replacing religion and its structures. And the modern state is built upon pillars of ideology and economics. Those two things work side by side in every nation state in the world. And the trouble that we find is that, again, the presuppositions about, in our culture as to what are important and what are necessary values are different. And so the utopia that the world is seeking is almost impossible to find because we're coming at it from such different places. Even this weekend, I've been reading through the kind of the news reports of the Communist Party conference or Congress in China. That's been an interesting read for me, just to hear how actually kind of frightened they are about the situation they're finding themselves in, and they feel, at least according to what was said by the chairman there, that they're feeling themselves surrounded and closed in and imperiled in a way that they haven't felt for some time before. And some comments or some observations said it was interesting to hear what wasn't said. Because in the past two conferences, and these are held every 5 years, so in the past two conferences, there were two very prevailing themes that were repeated, almost to the point where nobody paid any attention to them because they were repeated so often, and it talked about, things are okay, we're in a place of economic opportunity and growth and so forth, and we will pursue that as we find these strategic moments that are emerging for us. And none of that was said this time around. And they said that's just as important as what was said, because now they see themselves in a different place. And I kept thinking to myself, really? China feels imperiled? How many people do they have surrounded? how big is that place? It's huge, isn't it? But, the ideology is what's driving that, And the same thing with Russia. You look at this whole Russia-Ukrainian thing. Really? But it's the ideology. Well, what's driving this guy? And then people are thinking, well, what's his presupposition? And you begin nailing that down. Well, obviously for him, the most traumatic thing in his whole life was what? The breakup of the USSR. He thinks that was a tragedy, beyond belief. So what's his goal? To get it back. Okay? So arguing about, well, should we do this or that or whatever, if you understand that that's this guy's goal,
then you begin to think, well, we need to respond to that issue rather than the kinds of things that simply say, well, if you do this, we'll do that kind of stuff. I don't know if we can do that on an international. I'm just simply saying that's the kind of situation that and to some degree that's true in all these international conflicts and in different hemispheres and so forth. You read the theology that's coming out of the Southern Hemisphere now, it's very different than European theology. But they're coming at it from a different point of view. The European theology was developed from a place of aristocracy and privilege, and Southern Hemisphere theology is coming out of a place of deprivation, and they see things much differently. And so the parables, for instance, are very different to them. And Jesus' solidarity with the poor is very important to them and a very prevailing value. And it's not so much a prevailing value for us. When we read the parable of the rich young man, we're quick to say, well, Jesus only said that to this guy. He didn't say it to everybody. But down there, they have a different take on that. They say that more as a metaphor, that probably the distribution of wealth is a more important piece than we will allow.
Could you define ideology, or however you say that? I think you said economics and ideology are the two driving things in most, but I'm struggling a little bit with ideology.
Well, ideology is kind of like a worldview that says this is what we understand to be true about the world and our place in it, and these are the principles that we will live by in order to preserve our understanding of that world, and so it is kind of a philosophy, but a culturally immersed philosophy that says this is how we sustain this idea. And so ideology begins with an idea. That's the basis of the word, an idea. And then a social structure and a culture and a system of life is developed from that idea. So when you talk about ideology, that's somewhat of a negative term because it's actually a neutral term, but it can be a negative term because it can identify a wrong idea and say, okay, whereas ideology is kind of a neutral thing. It's kind of like, a lot of our life is fairly neutral. The quality of the life is what makes it righteous or not, Speech is neutral. Truth is a positive quality of speech, and lying is a negative quality of speech. But speech itself is neutral as an idea, and so ideology tends to then define one of those as the more important piece. And I don't just mean about speech, but ideas and values and so forth. So for instance, it becomes very clear when you look at Bonhoeffer's situation. What culture was he living in? Germany in the 1930s and 40s and all of that. Okay, so the lead up to World War II. So what became the prevailing ideology? National Socialism, right? So the Nazi Party became the prevailing worldview and driver of the government of that time. So what are some of the common values that we know were part of that ideology? Race was a big one. Okay, so who was the dominant race? Aryans. Okay, and so who weren't? The Jews, right? Well, but they had to find a villain, didn't they, to justify the aggression that they wanted to pursue in the world to regain what? Their honor, because what was really driving their dissatisfaction? World War I, and the loss, and worse than the loss, it was the the reparations from World War I that really created disaster for the culture of Germany. And so they suffered under those extreme reparations, and they were humiliated in that process, and they felt impoverished, and they felt helpless, and so forth. So they became ripe for, we're going to get rid of all this and restore our dignity and value and worth as a people. And so we're going to ignore these things, and we're going to pursue these things, and people gravitated to that because they were tired of feeling impoverished, and so they said, okay, and so it starts out small, and then by the time you realize how devastating it is, it's already so entrenched that you can't change it, and you can't get away from it. So that's an ideology. So that became their ideology, and so purity of the race becomes an important issue in that kind of thing. And so that's why then Germany became very, very concerned about that, and tracing your lineage was important. So I think I told you that my parents came over after the war. My folks were German. My whole family is German, and my dad was in the German army. He had the good sense to surrender when he could, and so he was imprisoned in a French prison camp during the war. And that whole story is very interesting and funny and amazing in many ways. And I'm very glad that it happened the way it is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this class today. But what's interesting though is that because they lived in that society and time, they had to trace their lineage. And so I've got somewhere in my boxes that say Frank's stuff, I've got that kind of lineage thing, that scroll that he had to produce, and so forth. So it was very interesting, So it's not like the, what is that? It's not like Ancestry.com, no. But it's a very specific kind of thing. You have to show exactly how the line has been preserved and how where you are in that whole process, and so forth. So even though they weren't, my folks were Baptists. And my grandfather was a minister, a lay leader in that, because the Baptist church wasn't very strong in Germany, and so he was a lay preacher, and he would go around and preach. But he was a banker during the week, but he was a lay preacher on the weekend, and so forth. So they were very staunch German, and they got caught up in this whole thing just like everybody else. Whenever I talk to my dad about this, he wasn't very forthcoming in a lot of it. Not because he was an active participant in the ideology, but because he just was very uncomfortable talking about it. And his thing was, I was just a soldier fighting for my country, that's all. He didn't have any higher political kinds of stake in this. It was just like they drafted me and said, you're going to be in a tank. And he said, okay. And his brother was a submarine officer, and he was lost at sea. And then my grandfather, he was an officer from World War I. And they went and grabbed him back and said, well, you've got experience, does your uniform still fit? Kind of a thing. He had the good sense to get captured, and he spent the war in Russia, at a prison camp for German officers. At the end of the war, they kept him for 3 years. And then they just opened the gate and said, okay, bye-bye.
Have a nice hike.
Exactly. He walked home from Russia, and just showed up at the back door one day. Yeah. It's like, yeah. Wait a minute, we sold all your clothes. No, Yeah, so I mean, the idea, though, the ideology had carried things away, and even when it got to the place where people knew it was a lost cause, they couldn't do anything about it, because it was so entrenched. And so Bonhoeffer sees this, and he's obviously caught in the grip of that. I mean, he is being crushed by that ideology even while he's thinking about these things and so forth. And he realizes that the state has immense power when it becomes the driving value of the society and so forth. And it reveals the shadow side of human autonomy. Yes, we are the creators of our own destiny and our world and all of that, but we still are flawed people, and we still have to deal with that. And so, Bonhoeffer recognizes that responsible persons think clearly about the consequences of their actions. You don't just jump in and do something. You think about the consequences. But people driven by ideology strive instead for purity, ideological purity. And so their idea justifies the actions. They may not like the means to get there, but the end is what's important. So the guiding factor then in these kinds of situations shifts away from the question of how we ought to live together in society, which is what responsible people do, and it shifts more towards the more pragmatic consideration of how people actually do live together and how that can be effectively managed or controlled. And so that's the world come of age. And Bonhoeffer sees that galloping, and he sees that from a disinterested position and says, okay, how then, what shape does Christ take in that kind of a world? That's the question that he's asking. What shape does Christ take? And we are living in that world, as we talked about last week. And so what is it that we can gain from this? So let me make a suggestion, then we can chat about this, and you'll have to be ready if people want to chat. Or we can turn off the tape, and then you can say what you want. So the contemporary world works on the basis of a certain type of understanding that values experience, rationality, the immediate, and probability as factors in constructing our world, which is really a good definition of practical atheism. Okay, they're not thinking about what is God after, what is God doing, where is the meta narrative that we talked about in our last class. In the meta narrative, they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about what do we need to do. So the godless world gives Christians, without manipulative appeals to guilt, which is an important piece of that. See, that's the presupposition piece. The church often moves easily into guilt because it's so easy to do, right? It's so easy to do. But they're presuming that the people will have guilt about not being these kinds of people or holding these kinds of values. And what you're really up against is people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's basically, the response is, I just don't care. I just don't care. And so it gives this world gives Christians, without manipulative appeals to guilt, the chance to question what the coming of age has brought us. So in a sense, we have this opportunity now to confront the world at its place of greatest strength, where it's, this is what we've constructed. And we can ask, well, what has been constructed? And we can begin this process of holding the world accountable for its freedom. To say, okay, how has your creativity, or how has the creativity of humankind benefited our world? And of course, there's going to be positive ways that it has, but there's going to be a whole bunch of negative ways that it has too. And so part of this maybe comes back to another Phil, Dr. Phil. What was his tagline? He was a talk show host. I'm not endorsing him by any means.
Well, I like this tag. I didn't watch him either, but I got the tagline.
I can't remember. I know who he is, but
He's a psychologist. His tagline was always, "How's that working for you?"
We use it all the time and didn't know where.
You didn't know where it came from. That's where it came from. Because he would go through and people would explain their situation and why they're doing blah, blah, blah. And then his simple question was, well, how's that working for you? And the answer is always, well, it's not working very well. It's like, okay, are you ready for a different way, an alternative approach? And I think that's the question of the church, that church poses to the world as we confront them at the hubris of their creative genius. Well, how's that working for us? Do we really want to be these people? And part of it is to be truthful about that. The church, the followers of Jesus have to be so centered in reality. And this is where this whole idea of the church the world coming of age as a positive thing is helpful in that regard. Because we're not trying to project our imagination into what the world ought to be and then inviting people or coercing people into that imaginary place. We're just dealing with the reality of the way things are. Okay, how's that working? And you can celebrate the successes, but you also have to be honest about the failures. And this is I think a huge battle in our world, in our society right now as it is. There's a lot in our society where people don't want to accept the reality of who we are or who we have been in the past. And it's easier just to say, well, that's the past, without realizing that the past has informed and shaped our view of the present. And depending on where you were in that past, that's shaped how you view where you are now. And to many of us, again, what's the presupposition? We're not all coming from the same place. And so the church has to in some way be able to form that question to say, okay, how are we doing? How's the world doing? And be ready to then say, well, what are some different ways this could happen? What are some different outcomes, and how do we get there? So that's what I want to spend just the last few minutes of our time together. What do you think about that? How does the church do that? Where do you think the church can do that? What's the best way to do it? Or are you just kind of going, just let us out. We're done. We're done. It's too much.
no microphone. You guys go ahead. What do you guys think? Or you were ready for them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If this is the world that we're living in, and I think that it is, the world come of age, how does the church respond to that? What's the reality? See, next week we're going to talk about the eclipse of religion, which is how the church has been unable to live into the reality of the world as it is. And so maybe you want to reserve your comments until next week.
I was just going to say, that's really the question of the age that the church is grappling with, not very well in a lot of cases, for the last, I don't even know how long.
Long time, yeah. A few decades. And some answers have come and gone already. So
Maybe it's instructive to look at some of the things that have been tried. Marxism. On the initial part of it, it sounds great, from everyone according to his ability, to everyone according to his needs. And the thing they left out is human nature. People begin seeing, well, gee, I don't have to work very hard. I get a part of the pie, no matter what. And so eventually it fails. The Soviet Union failed, Nazi Germany failed, or at least Marxism failed.
Pie gets pretty small, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, when there aren't that many. And you look at the Scandinavian countries and you say, well, gee, they've got these enormous taxes. Everybody seems happy. Now, with the influx of a whole bunch of immigrants, many Muslim who don't have this Christian work ethic drilled into them, things are beginning to fall apart. And I'm not smart enough to figure out what do we do about motivating people who don't want to be motivated.
Yeah, well.
We used to have workhouses. Now, some of them were terrible things, but I grew up when there was a workhouse in Indiana. And if you couldn't make it, well, okay, you go out to the farm.
But you didn't grow up in it.
Oh, no, I didn't grow up in it.
What's a
But
workhouse? A workhouse is.
there would be something that run by the state usually, or county. And they would provide you with housing. You would have a list of chores that you needed to get done. And he who didn't work, neither let him eat. Started going back to a biblical principle there. But you needed overseers. And this attracted people who were psychopaths in some cases. So that wasn't working.
How's that working for you?
Not very well. So
The idea is fine, but the actual
You inject humanity into it.
it screws it up. Yeah, like Charlie Brown's famous response. You know, humanity I love, it's people I can't stand.
I would just throw out that, I mean, we could talk about big strategies or others and how different strategies of the church are working effectively in some ways and not in others. But I see it as very personal that I have been blessed by Christians in my life that have served me or invited me to serve, and I think that is when we members and the church are at their best, is when we love other people. And we'll always be flawed some in our attitudes or our understandings, but showing that love, I mean, whether it's at work or not, how many of you have had a coworker come up to you sometime when there's a tragedy in their life, even though you never said anything to them, and they come to talk to you? I mean, that's just an example of some of it. And I think all of you have had that experience.
Yeah.
I was thinking along those lines too, that during Christ's time, the world wasn't a warm and fuzzy place either, you know,
No.
Romans and all that. And his response was not necessarily to try to change the structure, you know, through the structure that was already there.
Yeah.
He did it by the people he met individually. So I don't know what the answers are. Yes, the world's kind of messed up, but I know that for me personally, it needs to be how I meet people day to day.
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful, Peggy. Thanks, because that's exactly where Bonhoeffer ends up going. That Jesus is that. So that's, you know, so you don't have to come for the next 2 weeks. So Jesus is the answer. Everything you need to know about God is wrapped up in Jesus and how Jesus was, and so you begin to work that out in how you live with people, and you see how Jesus resisted those structures. I mean, Jesus didn't. They wanted to make him king, remember? And so what did he do? He said, "No, thanks," and he slipped away.
Did you not hear a word I said?
Yeah, he said, "No." So, and then when Peter and John, remember when they wanted to destroy that village for not letting them come in because they were going to Jerusalem, shall we call down fire from heaven? You know, in other words, like, we have that power. And Jesus was like, you've not been listening. That's not what we're here to do, you know. And even when the woman was caught in adultery, all right? So they came to her, or they came to him with her. And a lot of people look at that and they're confused by that. Well, why did they come to him? And why did he react the way that he did? And
if you know the Jewish law at that time, of course, where should they have taken that woman? Before that, to the temple, to the high priest. Okay, but they were bringing her to Jesus. So they were asking Jesus to act as the high priest in that.
Usurp somebody's role.
Yeah, and so, but Jesus resisted that too. Not in a way that said, "I don't want to be the high priest, this way. Make me the high priest a different way." He didn't. He just deflected the whole thing. But so he resisted being a political leader. He resisted being a religious leader. He resisted, popular opinion. The whole book of Mark, the first half of the book of Mark, is written under this umbrella of it's called the Messianic secret. Because he didn't want anyone to know. Because we all know why, right? Because of the popular understanding of what a Messiah was going to be, he wasn't that. It was like, you're going to be disappointed. I'm not going to be that. So he didn't want his disciples to get all caught up in that. And try as they might, they still got caught up in that, to some degree. Not as the people would have. But so there was this whole idea where Jesus was trying to resist being squeezed into a particular singular identity of who he was, because it was about not what he was, but who he was, in terms of the way he related to people. And that the way we begin to live into this kind of a world has to go back somehow to Jesus, to that.
The 40 days of struggle with Satan in the wilderness, where he was tempted to do things that were within his power, and on the surface might have looked good,
Yeah.
rocks into bread, people are hungry. I think that it took me a long time to understand that one of the points of that was not that he shouldn't do those things, but the reason for doing those things from the worldview was what was wrong.
Yeah. Yes, yes. And I think what's interesting what you bring out is that he never used his power for personal gain or benefit. That he always used what was available to him for others. And that's what we often miss about that. And that's what becomes a snare to many in the church, because they think the gain, we're more like Simon the magician. Give me this power. How much do I have to pay you so that when I say these words, the Holy Spirit will fall. We're a lot like that. We're tempted to those things. But Jesus never used his power for himself. It was always for the sake of others. And that becomes a key point. So hang on to that idea. That's where we're going. All right. Hey, I'm sorry I took 4 minutes of your time. Thank you.